Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from London is Adam Garrie. He's the director of Eurasia Future, a global policy and analysis centre. Ai Sun Oh is a senior fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. With us from Geneva is international business executive Philippe Monnier. And joining us right here in Washington in our studio is Yun Sun. She heads the Stimson Centre's China program and also serves as the co-director of the Centre's East Asia program. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Yun Sun, let's start here in the studio. As we just reported, total trade between China and other countries in the Belt and Road Initiative, the other partners that China has, it amounted to $6.5 trillion between 2013 and 2018. Has this initiative been a success?
Well, 5 years into the Belt and Road Initiative, we do see an increase of the trade volume between China and the BRI countries. We also see a major increase of China's overseas investment towards these countries, as well as the concessional loans, development financing to these countries. So I would say that from the Chinese perspective, looking from all these indicators, the Belt and Road Initiative has been relatively successful so far, although there are suspicion and skepticism from some of the recipient countries, as well as mostly from the Western countries. So there's a lot of homework to be done by China in those regards. Right,
certainly not a perfect system yet. Let's go to Adam Garrie in London. Adam, China's State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he recently spoke about the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is what he had to say. Let's listen.
During the past 6 years since the Belt and Road Initiative was proposed, practical cooperation has yielded fruitful outcomes as a number of connectivity cooperation programs have been delivered. Because of their participation in the Belt and Road, some countries have built their first cross-sea bridge or their first highway. Others have constructed their gateway to the sea or developed their indigenous industrial system for the first time. In addition, international institutions like the United Nations and the World Bank have actively supported the Belt and Road. In fact, the Belt and Road has brought concrete benefits to people in the partner countries. Statistics show that the economic and trade parks jointly built by Chinese enterprises in relevant foreign countries have contributed nearly 300,000 jobs to the local economy.
So, Adam, what is your assessment of this initiative?
I think it's incredibly important. The world right now is on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution. This will change the nature of international supply chains. It will change the nature of production, of living standards, and of the very basic models of employment itself. Belt and Road presents very important concrete solutions to all of these challenges that will affect both the developing world in a positive way as well as the developed world. This is particularly the case because the developing world stands at essentially a fork in the road. In the middle of the 21st century, pardon me, the 20th century, we saw decolonization as a watershed in the history of Asia, Africa, and even parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. It is now in the interests of the developing world to pool their collective talents in order to achieve greater, more rapid, and crucially sustainable development. Equally, and on the opposite end of that spectrum, the challenge for the developed world is to avoid stagnation, a decrease in living standards, and high unemployment. Belt and Road, by creating connectivity in terms of investment, infrastructure, trading opportunities, and finance, can help both sides of the international economic spectrum achieve success at a time when the world is changing a great deal.
Okay, let's go to Singapore, to Ai Sun Oh. Ai Sun Oh, Singapore has been a major destination for Chinese investment under the umbrella of the BRI. Has Singapore seen tangible results?
Well, Singapore is always the financial center for this part of the world, together with Hong Kong and to a lesser extent Tokyo. So when you talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, part of it is about capital flowing around the region, and inevitably a lot of this capital will have to go through Singapore. So Singapore will provide, shall we say, the financial wherewithal for more adequately deploying this Belt and Road Initiative funding on the one hand. And on the other hand, Singapore would also have a lot of expertise to share with a lot of regional countries. So when China proposed this Belt and Road Initiative, well, Singapore would of course have to be a very active participant, because well, Singapore itself, it's a very successful example of how a third world country could become a first world country. So together with China and the rest of the Belt and Road Initiative countries, I think Singapore could play a very significant role.
Isana, what do you make, though, of criticism? There was some criticism from the Malaysian deputy minister who said that some BRI projects create a financial burden for governments who are recipients of aid.
Well, the different developing countries, they are at different stages of development by definition. In China, for example, when you build certain railroads or ports or airports and so on, very soon you will see the areas surrounding those airports and ports and railways being developed very spectacularly. Unfortunately, that is not the case in some other developing countries. So, well, you simply could not just replicate what is working in China to the rest of the Belt and Road countries. You had to sort of adapt to the local circumstances. Sometimes, for example, you do need railroads, but perhaps you don't need high-speed rail. You need double-track railroads in order to move along people as well as materials more efficiently. But perhaps the local economic circumstances would not support a high-speed rail at the moment, for example.
All right, let's go to Geneva, to Philippe Monnier. Philippe, Switzerland will sign an agreement backing the Belt and Road Initiative. What is the significance of that? What kind of impact would that have on Switzerland?
You know, Switzerland is a country which has very good relations with China, as well as with most of the countries in the world. Switzerland want to support the Belt and Road Initiative. Switzerland want to support Swiss companies taking part in this initiative. At the same time, very often we don't join officially an initiative, like we are not member of the EU, but we collaborate a lot with the EU. So it is also a little bit the same thinking. We support the initiative, we participate, maybe not officially, but we participate, we support Swiss companies. And yes, I would say it is important in terms of symbolism, and I'm sure that it will have an important effect in Switzerland and to some extent in China.
Yunsun, I want to get back to this criticism that we hear very often about the debt burden that the BRI places on local governments. It is something that the head of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, she talked about this recently. Let's watch. This is what she had to say.
The world is short of investment in infrastructure. So the fact that an initiative such as the Belt and Road Initiative focuses on the financing of infrastructure around the world is certainly welcome. We have also encouraged and called the attention of Chinese authorities to the fact that those projects have to be adequate and appropriate for the country's needs, that those financing have to be respectful of debt sustainability. I think that the Chinese authorities themselves are now really paying attention to that.
So, Yunsun, does Christine Lagarde have a point there? Because China has already said that it will establish a new framework to resolve or ease debt risk.
I think both sides have good points. So what she is literally saying is there's a shortage of investment in infrastructure. But what she did not say is there's a shortage of money on the international financial market. So there's a reason as for why the capitals are not moving towards those infrastructure projects in less developed countries, because of the political risks or because of the social and environmental impact of these projects. And most importantly, because of financial implication of this type of loans or this type of investment as for whether the recipient government will be able to repay them. So this is emerging as a much bigger issue for China. Now the scale of the BRI investment is growing exponentially. So for China, of course, there's a narrative of China setting the debt trap for the recipient countries. But that trap, on the other hand, is also a lending trap. If China lends all this money to the recipient countries, which eventually do not have the capability to repay them, this will be a big financial problem for China's decision-making as well. So it is urgent for China and the recipient countries, all the countries participating in the BRI, to come up with a mechanism to better manage and solve this financial security problem and debt sustainability for the recipient countries.
Well, Adam, Garrie, what are your thoughts on that? Is this both a debt trap as well as a lending trap?
No, I don't see it that way. I see it as an opportunity that in previous decades wasn't available. One has to reflect on the fact that between the middle of the last century and the initiation of Belt and Road in 2013, far too many developing countries were left without opportunities because the major financial centers, which at that time were generally always in the West, didn't want to go into these countries. They had an aversion, whether rightly or wrongly. China, in going into these countries, realizing that there is so much untapped potential for win-win development that can help both sides, is taking that first step. And the other comment I'd make on that is that it is somewhat ironic when the countries that promote an open market-based system and a rules-based system of international trade, when China engages in best practices regarding international finance and with the promotion of a free and fair trading system, that somehow it faces criticism. It seems to be geopolitics doing the talking, but when you look at the pragmatics of the entire issue, it really just doesn't stack up in terms of these criticisms. One final point I'll make: Sri Lanka is brought up a lot in these kinds of discussions. It is a country that has 77% of its GDP as debt. However, debt to China is hovering at around 9%, which is incredibly low when you consider the amount of overall debt the country has. So I think it's quite unfair to single out China when we're talking about debt. Debt is a major issue, but it isn't the fault of any one particular nation.
Adam, Garrie, one other question, and this is how Europe is responding to the BRI initiative compared to the way the United States is. The US has sent a low-level delegation to the forum that's taking place in China. The US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has called BRI projects debt traps. Italy recently joined the project, and other EU countries are also open to joining it. So there seems to be a difference here between the countries of Europe on the one hand and the United States on the other.
That's certainly the case. Italy is, of course, the largest European nation to sign a memorandum joining Belt and Road, but there are now 17 European nations that are in Belt and Road as part of this 17+1 format. And among the business community in Europe, and indeed, I think among a lot of ordinary people, they look at China and they see a great deal of optimism that stems from dynamism. And in Europe, it is true that economies are either experiencing low or no growth. It is true that life is becoming more expensive for people working in the same kind of jobs whose wages went a lot further 5 or 10 years ago. And so people look to China and they see that it's an opportunity to export new goods, to import necessary goods, and to perhaps most importantly, exchange technological ideas and best practices, because obviously Europe has a lot of technology to offer the world, so does China. When you put those two together, you've got a great win-win outcome for all the sides involved.